Early in December 1980, an unknown young man traveled to New York City to kill the most famous pop singer in the world. This film is the killer's story as told by those who knew him and loved him. It's the story the killer told afterward to detectives and psychiatrists, but it's also a film about the danger of stories, and of one story in particular, a story used as a murder weapon. In 1980, a vital key to the killing of John Lennon proved to be a simple story, prompted by a favorite old song. By the evening of Monday, December 8, the unknown young man was standing outside the New York apartment of the famous pop singer. Here, in his own words, is what happens next. Think that's what happened. There was no motion, there was no way. It was nothing. It was dead silence. My boy, so quiet. He walked up, he looked at me. Tell you, the man was gonna be dead in less than 5 minutes. And he looked at me, looked at him, and he walked past me. And then I heard in my head say, do it, do it, do it. No, yes, do it, do it, do it. Like that, with my left hand. I don't remember I don't remember drawing. To be wherever you go, I just pull the trigger. Steady. 5 times. This individual, who is unidentified at this point but will be identified soon, fired 5 shots from a .38 caliber Charter Arms pistol. Mr. Lennon was struck several times. We're positive at this time as to how many times he was struck. It appears, at this time, that the individual is from out of town, possibly Hawaii. That's the way it looks at the moment. The unknown young man, 3 hours after he killed John Lennon, had a name, Mark David Chapman. This police video taken that night through a two-way mirror marks the beginning of the investigation into what turned him into a murderer. Police had found him minutes after the shooting, waiting for them quietly at the scene of the crime. He dropped his gun, and in its place, he was only carrying a paperback novel. Inside, he'd written, to Holden Caulfield, from Holden Caulfield, this is my statement. From that night onward, The Catcher in the Rye haunted the investigation into Lennon's killing. Made in 1955, it sparked prison interviews with detectives and psychiatrists. Chapman constantly returned to the same theme. Anyone, he said, who understood literature would understand why. You think about me and the terrible fall. I'm sorry I told so many people about it. Don't ever tell anybody anything, it might hurt you. You might really to the full scope of understanding of what I've stood for in my life, with the terrible fall and what I'm doing now, what I will be doing with each just might come to you. I'm praying that it will, that you realize that something very extraordinary has happened with an extraordinary book and without a go, an extraordinary person, and Lennon an extraordinary person, the Beatles, an extraordinary cultural movement in the 60s and other centers. Probably the main cultural experience, musically, again culturally, they changed the world as we know it. And I change. At his trial, Chapman pleaded guilty. A sentence was passed without his evidence being heard, until now. No one outside a prison cell has heard from Chapman himself why Lennon had to die. The reason I killed John was to gain prominence, to promote the reading of J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in the Rye. I'm not saying I'm the Messiah or nothing like that. If you read the book, and if you understand my past, but you seem to understand my past pretty well, and you would see that I am indeed the catcher in the rye of this generation. Our book for discussion in class this morning is J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. It is a book that is at the top of the list of the most banned books in the United States. The banning of Catcher in the Rye in many American schools is a curious fate for an acclaimed work of literature. Yet this funny, sad novel about a teenager driven to despair by the phoniness and hypocrisy of the adult world is often outlawed as dangerously subversive. The theme of funniness certainly is a predominant theme throughout the book, a crusade against phoniness, one critic called it. Teachers have been well aware of how deeply the book impresses some students and how intensely they identify with its hero, Holden Caulfield. But listen now, anyway. He started concentrating again. Then he said, "This fall, I think you're writing for is a special kind of fall, a horrible kind. The man falling isn't permitted to feel or hear himself hit bottom. He just keeps falling and falling. It's a special. I took a lot more with me than just myself. It was the last nail in the coffin of the 60s. There's a place I go." This is a recording Mark Chapman made of one of his own songs written in the late 60s. It does. Mark was a Southern boy born in Texas but raised here in this quiet, respectable suburb of Decatur, near Atlanta in Georgia. Later, he'd speak of an unhappy childhood spent in this house with a father he called cold and unresponsive. But his mother, questioned after the killing, said she noticed nothing wrong in those early days. At first, he did well at school, and everything seemed normal. When trouble came, rather than anything wrong with Mark himself, it seemed more like a sign of changing times. In August 1964, the Beatles arrived in America, and from the first, they provoked a response difficult to contain. In concert stadiums, with their arrival, the turbulent world of the 60s had begun. Little here to reassure conservative America. In 1966, Lennon's remarks about the Beatles and Jesus scratched a raw nerve. Greater, comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person, or God as a thing, or whatever it is. You know, I would just said what I said. It was wrong, or it was taken wrong. There now, it's all this Doug Layton and Tommy Charles reminding you that our fantastic Beatle boycott is still in effect. Don't you forget what the Beatles have said. Don't forget to take your Beatles records and your Beatles paraphernalia to any one of our 14 pick-up points in Birmingham, Alabama, and turn them in this week if possible. The group was big enough to ride out the controversy, but Lennon, sharp-tongued, hard-edged, and philosophical, had already begun to find a place apart from the other Beatles in Atlanta. Mark Chapman was swept along with the spirit of the times. His Beatle haircut and the Beatles songs he himself sang were only outward expressions of a more profound change. His school had become a center for the local drugs trade. Pupils boasted that Columbia High was rated #1 for drugs in the state, and as Mark slipped into the drug culture, he became known as a garbage head, someone who'd take almost anything. In the family, he became rebellious and hostile. When he was 15, he ran away from home. On another occasion, after taking LSD, he spent the night in police custody. He was at his lowest point when suddenly he heard the beat of another drum. You know, all across the country, there's a real Jesus revolution going on. He is the ultimate eternal trip, and we want you to go out and share everywhere that you go what Jesus Christ has done. In 1971, a service in a local church conducted by the Californian preacher Arthur Blessed was one of several religious experiences that suddenly brought Mark Chapman to Christ. Many of you just made a real commitment of your life to Jesus Christ. And at his place, when someone turns unto Jesus, we have them share their testimony, and many are loaded on drugs or have drugs in their possession. So we go into the restroom, and we have a toilet service, and we read a passage of scripture and say a word of prayer. Then we drop the drugs in the john, and just as we start to mash the handle down, we say the dope is gone, we flush it down. Remember, Jesus Christ is life's greatest trip. I had an encounter with Jesus Christ, and he came into my life. I was just nothing but a dope head, and I asked Christ to come into my life, and he came. I didn't see him, but he was there. I knew he was there, and I felt forgiven of all my sins and felt like my life was heading on the right track again. I read the Bible, and now I worked in inner-city Atlanta with kids that you just wouldn't believe. It was after his conversion that Mark met the girl who, many years later in prison, he would still call his only one true love. He had changed, his drug days, he had changed into being a Christian. He had very high morals, very high standards for himself and for me, and we were not to sway from those standards. At 15, as in love as I could be at the time, Corsi was 17 and growing up a little bit more, grown up than I was. But yes, we were in love. He had his own ways of thinking about things, that's the only way I can describe it, his own way of how he felt about things, about real things. And that's the way we had to be with each other. It was very honest and okay, you know, no eyes, no games. It was me in the end that said goodbye, and it was very hard for Mark. He didn't go on, he didn't say, okay, you know. So that didn't work, I need to pick myself back up and maybe spend some time with myself, like all of us do when a relationship comes to an end, and we learn from it and we go on. That didn't happen. Talking to you, as you know, brought a lot of things back for me, and I remember quite clearly finding out how shocked, I didn't register for the longest time. And now it's like, I feel totally helpless. So much. What can I do? I can't even tell. I can't tell friends because they would hate me. I had nothing to do with it, but there's very few people, you know, that I wouldn't even tell about this. It's a very hard thing to think about him spending the rest of his years there because he was such a special person. Such a kind and gentle, very gentle person. I'm not undermining in any way what he did, and for a long, long time, and still, you know, my sympathies for Yoko and all of these people that loved Lennon so much, that is so strong in me. But I also try to separate that. As I said, except for the Mark that I knew. What really happened? It just wasn't, he just wasn't, you couldn't have been in his right mind when he did it. Now, that Mark Chapman read Catcher in the Rye for the first time, he was 16, the same age as the book's hero, Holden Caulfield. And like Holden, who fears the loss of the innocent world of childhood, Mark now began to spend more of his time with children. This is his application form to become a camp leader at the YMCA in Decatur, where he worked with Vince Smith. I knew Mark Chapman quite well. He served as assistant director when I was director at Camp Coder. He was particularly good with little children. In fact, I've never seen a boy of his age that was so good at socializing. It was like a Pied Piper, they'd follow him around. He struck me as just a fine young boy. I didn't see a fault in him. He tended to have grand ideas and grand passions that would stick with him, and then one day, they'd be gone, and another one would come back. I felt that the Catcher in the Rye business was one of Mark's passions, but I didn't see anything in there that made me think that was going to be a more serious passion in another book. In fact, I figured that next week he'd have another book that he'd be trying to get a grip on. He certainly didn't see Holden Caulfield as a bad person. To me, he was his campaign. Nemo, I call myself Nemo for 7 years at times, he had day camp till I found out what Nemo meant. It means nothing, literally nothing. Listen, he was a very shy. She was 9 years old the summer she started camp, and the first day that I took her, she was very nervous and cried, and I left her crying, and I worried all day about how she was doing. When I came back to pick her up, she was walking up the hill, and she had her arm around Mark, and he had his arm around her, and there was this big smile on her face, and I knew that she had found a friend. He was just totally honest, totally sincere, he truly cared for me. And that is very odd for an adult to react that way for a child. He did not treat me like a child. He never spoke to me like I was a child. He spoke to me like I was his age and that I could understand everything that he was saying to me. But then again, he didn't really act like an adult. Well, it was unconditional love on your part that you had for Mark. There was no criticism. You accepted him as he was and loved him as he was, and I think that's the reason that Mark became close to me. Well, I think the fact that he was so gentle and passive with the children was a lot of what he wanted to be. He wanted to portray this very kind, gentle person with the children because he loved them very much. But obviously, like any other young person, he did have problems in his life. He really never said much of anything negative. Well, I think he did express at times that he was disappointed in people, but they didn't live up to what they should, the things they needed to give their very best at all times, and that they did not. But as far as any specifics, he did say that when someone was gone, they were dead. Yes, he did have an expression that once you did something that made him very angry to the point that he never wanted to see you again, he would say, well, he's dead. And I questioned him about that one time. I said, oh, they died. And he said, no, not really. They've died. But to me, there is something when you fall out of grace with Mark. He marked you off his list. And Lennon? We fell out of the grace of Mark. Someone asked us not long ago if we feel any hatred or any hostility toward him for what he did. Although we were appalled at his crime, no one can condone murder, can they? We were shocked and we were horrified, but to us, he was still the Mark who loved us and who gave us so much of himself, and we will always love him. Mark went on to win recognition and distinction with the YMCA. He worked briefly for them in Lebanon, and in 1975, he was sent to Fort Chaffee in Arkansas to help refugee children from Vietnam. My name is Mark Chapman, and I came to work at Fort Chaffee about 3 months ago. This is truly one of the best experiences I've ever had. It's so good to work closely with the Vietnamese people and to exchange culture and ideas. Despite the confident voice on the camp radio and glowing reports from his superiors, all was far from well with Mark Chapman. At Chaffee, he was closer than ever to the children, to whom he remained the Pied Piper, the cheerful organizer of camp games. But to co-workers, he appeared tense. He was something of a loner, moody, and frequently depressed. At Chaffee, he'd had his first sexual experience, but afterwards, felt ashamed and full of guilt. To one friend, it seemed he'd fallen out of grace with himself. Certainly, he'd changed from that point on. I didn't really go towards Mark like I used to. I didn't run up and hug him. I would speak, but I would keep a distance. It wasn't like he was the same person I had known at camp. He came to visit one time, and he came into the kitchen. I started to run up to hug him, but his face looked different, his eyes were cold, and I backed off. Mom says, "Aren't you going to go up and hug Mark?" And I kind of shook my head. His look's different. She says, "It's the same old Mark." But it wasn't the same old Mark. He had shark eyes, and he had no feeling in his face. He looked very cold and very unhappy. He scared me. Something was going wrong with the Pied Piper, something he couldn't control, and now he looked for a way of escape. In 1977, Mark Chapman arrived in Hawaii. In the past year, he'd walked out of the YMCA, failed at college, and broken off an engagement. Now he'd come to paradise, he'd come to spend all his money in one last fling at the smart hotels on Waikiki Beach, and when it ran out, to kill himself. On June 20th, he drove his car to the remote north of the island. Then connecting a hose to the exhaust, he tried to asphyxiate himself. The suicide bid ended when a fisherman knocked at the car window. "I think of myself," Chapman told doctors in the hospital afterward, "as a boxer in the 27th round, my face all bloody and bruised." To escape his depression, he'd come to Hawaii to kill himself. Next time, 3 years later, he'd strike out at someone else. In the late 70s, John Lennon, guru and idol of millions of fans, withdrew from the limelight and into private life. For 5 years, he gave no interviews and made no records. He disappeared from the public stage. In the autumn of 1980, journalist Larry Shane got his first big assignment to find out what had happened to John Lennon. With no direct route open to Lennon himself, Shane realized his research must take a more enterprising course. He'd heard that Lennon had acquired an exclusive estate on Long Island and so set off by boat to investigate. The Lennon I went looking for was a man who had always taken chances, musical chances, political chances, chances with his own sanity. I went looking for the Lennon who, by his appalling honesty, had shamed the world into examining itself. I went looking for the Lennon whose pained, goofy earnestness and paranoia was the emblem and conscience of an age. The Lennon I would have found was a 40-year-old businessman who watched a lot of television, who's got $150 million, a son whom he dotes on, and a wife who intercepts his phone calls. He doesn't do ridiculous things anymore. He stopped making errors and he stopped making music. Shane's voyage of inquiry never reached Lennon himself, but his account of what he did discover revealed a far more comfortable side to the rock star's tough, iconoclastic image. We now know that this Squire article was at the forefront of Chapman's mind as he plotted to kill Lennon. I felt just terrible when I heard about Chapman. The thought that my article in any way might have been one of the things that went through his mind was devastating to me. The article, at the beginning, had been undertaken rather in the spirit of a journalistic caper. The reporting itself was fun, and Lennon himself, in life, was such a towering figure that it didn't seem that he could in any way be hurt or even really touched by this sort of story. In Hawaii, Mark Chapman's own story seemed headed for calmer waters. He'd seen the failure of his suicide attempt as a message from God that he should make a new life for himself. At first, he'd settled here at Kailua. He'd come to Castle Hospital for treatment after the suicide bid, but stayed on to become a popular and useful employee. To Nurse Judy Harvey, whom he dated, Mark seemed cheerful, outgoing, and untroubled by past problems. Others weren't so sure. On the surface, I think most people would say that Mark was getting along fine, that he was well balanced, that the past episode in his life when he tried to take his life was over and that he was doing well. But there were certain little glimpses you'd get of Mark occasionally that would let you know things weren't all just right. When he was down, he was quiet, he was sullen. He really didn't want to talk too much. I didn't see Mark vent any of his anger and happiness in any violent way, but I would describe it as being sulky, and he would sulk. It seemed to be he just did not want to talk. You could always read Mark's moods like a book. You come in the morning, with just a glance at Mark and the expression on his face, you knew what Mark's frame of mind was. In 1978, Mark met Gloria Abe, a travel agent who'd helped him plan a world trip. The following year, they married. Yet despite the romance, his spells of depression continued, to the growing concern of his friends. We were concerned because of Mark's history and the fact that he had tried to kill himself, and when he would sink into a depressed mood that would get some of us rather worried. Granted, all of us have ups and downs, but with Mark, the UPS seemed to be a little higher and the downs seemed to be a little lower. With his history, we were concerned. These were markings and signs of a very troubled young man, capable, we thought, of inflicting damage to himself. As I mentioned to you before, when we heard that he shot John Lennon, it didn't particularly surprise us that he was capable of violence. We just didn't think he would direct that violence towards someone else. Throughout 1980, the cycle of depression became acute. In 1980 in Honolulu, Chapman began a new project. His plan was to go through every book in the state library. It had been a year of projects taken up enthusiastically and dropped suddenly, but now Chapman found something that really gripped him: James Lundquist's critical study of J.D. Salinger. Chapman re-entered the world of The Catcher in the Rye and its hero, Holden Caulfield. In Holden, Chapman discerned a powerful reflection of his own condition. His admiring letter to Professor Lundquist was signed, "A 25-year-old catcher." At the same time, he continued in the library. And I was probably angered at his findings. I mean, I wasn't fuming, I was saying what a phony he was. Then I talked to myself. For Lennon, there could be no escape from celebrity. Pictures like these were still too powerful. Lennon's long career of public exposure, the whole era of the 60s, now he was seeking seclusion. No one had forgotten the primal scream. "If a body meet a body coming through the rye." The first words of Robbie Burns' famous song. But in the novel The Catcher in the Rye, the hero Holden Caulfield is spellbound by a young child singing, "If a body catch a body coming through the rye." From this small difference, Holden derives his philosophy, his disgust for the phoniness of adults, his love of the innocence of children, and why he himself should become the catcher in the rye. Stopping children from accidentally falling over the cliff is symbolic. The child is symbolic of the transition to adulthood. When a child goes off the cliff, he becomes a dog. 9 times out of 10 he becomes a father who doesn't want to see that. English. See a whole world full of nothing, the children are phonies, and he wants to catch them and keep them. But you see what happened to Holden. Yes, he does fall, clear he does fall. So that's what's happened to me, I will never hit bottom, never. I'll just keep falling off the cliff, but I never did become a dog. On October 23, Mark Chapman signed his timesheet at work for the last time. 4 days later, he bought a gun, a .38 caliber Saturday Night Special. Now, at their apartment in Honolulu, while his wife worked, Chapman stayed at home listening to Beatles tapes and drawing up his plan. "I just got depressed again, quit my job, found a gun, killed somebody. That's what happened." In November 1980, Chapman arrived back in Atlanta. He just spent a week in New York, waiting in vain to see John Lennon. The last time I heard from him was in November or in the first week of December. I remember on the phone he said, "I won't be back through here again." And I said, "What do you mean you won't be back into the States?" Meaning from Hawaii again. And he said, "I just don't think I'll be back through Atlanta again." And he said, "I'd like to get together, and I thought we could talk over old times." And I was very uncomfortable with that. I felt like, why do you want to talk about that time? You know, this is now. That's weird, and I thought that was all settled. I thought that was all settled. And he got very upset, and he said, "Aren't they important to you?" I remember him almost at the point of tears. You know, it was very emotional for him. "Aren't they important to you?" So that was the time I just thought, I could have saved him. I guess we never said goodbye, and it's not that he's dead in my mind, it's that it's gone. I guess he was gone a long time ago, and I just didn't know what I was sensing. I think he stayed back in 1972. Chapman had also come to Atlanta for bullets and for target practice in the nearby woods, where 5 years before, Leonard Florence had been his shooting instructor. Mark Chapman was a little better than average shot, if he were academically graded, his ability would be about a C+. He was like this distance from my grandmother, who has been dead many years. I couldn't miss you at this range. The fact that he had any training at all at this range has nothing to do with where your training is in valuing. You go backwards, and when that other person can shoot back, Lennon. As far as I know, was he so with Chapman any danger whatsoever? On Saturday, December 6, 1980, Mark Chapman returned to New York City. New York was where John Lennon lived. It was also the setting for The Catcher in the Rye. For 3 days, in the book, from Saturday to Monday, Holden Caulfield drifts from place to place in growing desperation. Now, from Saturday to Monday, Chapman's 3 days began partly on the track of Lennon, partly in the footsteps of The Catcher in the Rye. In the book, Holden annoyed impatient taxi drivers with the question, "Where do the ducks in Central Park go in winter?" Chapman now went to Central Park to ask the same question. In the book, Holden checked into a cheap hotel and felt ill at ease in his small, miserable room. Now lodged at the $16 a night YMCA, Chapman quickly became dejected. And like Holden, he took great offense at noises from across the hallway. When the book was published in 1951, one critic wrote that the character of Holden Caulfield is hardly the model parents would want for their children. Fortunately, he went on, there can't be many of them. Yet on his last night, Chapman had a prostitute sent up to his room. In this, too, he was following the book. And as with Holden before him, there was no sex. He paid the woman twice the normal rate before sending her away. These coincidences, Chapman would later describe as accidental signs. He claimed that destiny was at work. The story of Catcher in the Rye ends back in Central Park by the carousel. Here, as he watches his little sister go round and round, the tired and confused young hero of the novel finds a kind of grace at last and relief from the mental turmoil that has haunted him throughout the book. But for Chapman, watching the carousel that final weekend, there would be no grace for him, there'd be one more chapter. While Chapman sat by the carousel, a few hundred yards away in the Dakota Building, John Lennon and Yoko Ono were at home, unaware they were spending their last weekend together. Within the past few weeks, Lennon had suddenly re-emerged on the public stage. There was a new record in the shops and long interviews in the press. Chapman would later say that these interviews had summed up Lennon's whole life, and in the lyrics on the new album, Chapman found a confirmation that Lennon had recognized his destiny and that their two paths would now converge. People say I'm crazy, doing what I'm doing. Well, they give me all kinds of warnings to save me from ruin. I'm just sitting here watching the wheels go round and round. I really love to watch them roll. No longer riding on the merry-go-round, I just had to let it go. It's incredible, the whole thing is just. On December 8, Mark Chapman, who had moved into the expensive Sheraton Center Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, woke up late at around 10:30. He dressed warmly, and on his table, he made a display of his possessions, his Bible, his passport, and a still of his favorite film. This is my statement, that's the way destiny works. You don't always just do it. I kept saying, just go back to the hotel. Go home now. You know, don't do it. Go back to right now. Do it now. I don't know why the world and I thought killing this guy then would be all over for me. That would kinda be a solution, in a way, to everything. So, at that time, this self-destruction would be a blessing. If you knew what Holden went through and if you knew that Holden wanted to die, really, then you'd understand. And I kept it in for so long yet he understood what he was doing. He understood there was something against it. Only mugshots are photographs of criminals, they reveal nothing about why someone commits a crime. In Chapman's case, there was no shortage of explanations, some far-fetched, some conspiratorial, some clearly derived from the police headlines. Like these, they addressed a deep need for an explanation. But did they explain anything? If Chapman's motive was a mystery, it was also a battlefield. The prosecution believed he killed Lennon to become famous, the defense claimed he was insane. The psychiatrists disagreed. Before them was a young killer who certainly knew he was Mark Chapman but also believed he was the personification of a fictional character. So much bigger than guilty or not guilty. I think people have fantasies all the time, and people identify with stories they read all the time. You become involved in a book or you become involved in a movie, but to have it become your life and use it as a script for carrying out some very strongly felt mission is something quite unusual. I think he identifies with the gentleness of Holden Caulfield because Mark identifies also with the innocent children of the world. He sees himself as their advocate, he feels himself to be one of the innocent children of the world and he is going to do everything in his power to avoid hitting the bottom of that cliff. Mark probably saw John Lennon as a representative of a very well-known individual who had been an innocent child and had fallen off the cliff, becoming an evil, exploitative phony adult, deserving of whatever punishment Mark was going to mete out. With Lennon's murder, Mark Chapman joined the growing ranks of America's celebrity killers. Understanding them has become a matter of urgency, they are unpredictable, they strike at random and come from nowhere. Gavin de Becker, a specialist in security for the famous, is working with the FBI on research to understand more about celebrity attackers. Our office has about 4,000 people under assessment, and we have a whole group that are similar to Chapman, in terms of the pre-incident indicators, the factors that are part of their lives before they commit their attack. And Chapman is not unfamiliar to us. They are unsettled and unhappy and travel from somewhere else only to find themselves unsettled and traveling again. I can see that randomized travel in almost every serious case where a public figure is attacked or near attacked occurs. This society is focusing on famous people and celebrities and making celebrities with a fury that's never existed before. In days gone by, the mass media really was just the Bible. The Bible is a story that your grandmother told you, and that's what you eventually went on to learn. Well, now media and media figures play a much greater role in all of our lives. You and I maybe can draw the line between what's appropriate and inappropriate in terms of that relationship, but mentally ill people cannot effectively edit out the inappropriate. And against that background, we have to see ourselves in them as well because there is an acceptable level of idolatry. All of us have idols and pursue those, but what is a mild drug for some of us is a poison for some others, and Chapman is one of those others. This is Hogan's Alley. It is a stage set, a fantasy world where the FBI rehearses the stakeouts, sieges, and gunfights that are the reality of violence in America today. But the rise of the so-called media criminals has meant concentrating on new targets. Dr. Park Dietz is a forensic psychiatrist who, for the past 5 years, has been studying the relationship between the public and celebrities for the National Institute of Justice. People who identify with characters in books and films begin to take on some of their characteristics in real life or choosing to do that. It's fashionable to think of this as an involuntary process in which somehow the individual's mind is taken over by the character, where they become possessed, a kind of demon. An illogical view of it. But in fact, they're choosing to go to that film, they're choosing that character for identification, and it is a normal process of development to choose particular features from role models, to choose what we want to be from among the various options available to us. The individual who subjects himself repeatedly to exposure to inappropriate models, who takes on those characteristics to try to become like that, is choosing his fate. The role of the artist is to invent fantasy worlds. People may choose to enter them temporarily, enjoy them, and leave and exit to reality. But for a large segment of our population, the fantasy world becomes reality, and there are those who live within that fantasy. Central Park, not far from the Dakota, not far from the Carousel. Here, every Saturday during the summer, children come to listen to stories underneath the statue of Hans Christian Andersen. From time to time, we all fall under the spell of the storyteller. But little is known of how these stories affect our imagination, of how we grow up knowing what stories to believe, or by what means we draw the line between what we call fantasy and what we call reality. And it is an important line. Stories can delight us and enchant us, but stories can be dangerous. A single story can lead to murder. December 1980, at a vigil outside the Dakota Building, New Yorkers lament the death of John Lennon. Amongst the crowd, another young man with a gun in his pocket. His name was John Hinckley. 4 months later, he shot President Reagan. Amongst possessions seized when police broke into his hotel room, there was a paperback novel, a well-thumbed copy of The Catcher in the Rye.